Parsing in Final Fantasy XIV has always been a PP measuring contest for most raiders. But for me, it's more of a tool so you're not too shitty at a game that you drag your team down. Since this is a co-op game and you need to respect other people's time. So in this video, I will try to explain how I usually try to get good at Final Fantasy XIV by using these two tools, FFLOGS and XIVanalysis. Basically what we are trying to do is these 4 simple steps. Number 1, decide which fight you want to analyze and improve. Number 2, find a good comparison to your log in the same fight. Number 3, identify your problems in FFLOGS for each phase of the fight. And number 4, upload to XIVanalysis and compare your rotation. The easiest way to explain this is by example, and coincidentally, I've been progging off classes for some ultimates and savages in PF to warm myself up for the upcoming expansion Dawn Trail. Since I play mainly tank, I've been trying to even out my skills on tank, and recently I just cleared DSR on my Dark Knight, my last tank class to clear the but obviously, since I'm just pressing buttons without much research, I know my rotation is not optimized and I want to improve that. But before we start, please note that this method works if you are rather new to the class or less experienced in a certain fight that is not on patch or newly released. Since these tools won't work on patch and optimizing on patch is an entirely different thing. I might talk about it on a different video next time. But first off, if you don't know how to use FFLOGS, please look up so many tutorials on YouTube about it. I won't be explaining too much on how to use it because everyone has done it. So basically, I'm going to use the instance where I'm curious about my performance in a specific fight. In this case, my recent Dark Knight clear in DSR. The easiest way to improve is to compare yourself with some of the top players in that fight that uses the same class. In this case, I check on FFLOGS, Ultimates, Dragon Song Surprise, Rankings, then I choose Damage, and then Dark Knight. The first one I usually check are the top ones and what are they doing on downtimes and reopeners because that is usually the trickiest part about optimization. But the ones I dive deep into are usually the ones with lesser crit variance, usually the ones on the top 20. So I'm sure to know that it's their rotation that is doing the job and not their crits. I think this one from Inori is good, since the crits are decent but not too high. I usually like to check the ones around 20 to 30% crit rates and not the ones above 50. I'm not saying their rotation is usually wrong, but just to lessen the variable so I can reliably compare their damage with mine. That's why the next step after finding the good logs is to compare my damage with the top players in each phase. First, because it's an ultimate and it comes with different phases separated by downtimes and different bosses, it's easier to compare it based on each phases. If it's Savage or Extreme, you might usually only deal with one phase, and this process will be a lot shorter. But I will still explain this with an ultimate so I can get into more details. But to sort it out, click here on the all phases and choose the phase you want to check. Since the first phase of DSR is not counted because it's a door boss, we're going straight to P2. And to make it easier, I'll just compare my logs, screenshot, and Inori's side by side. So in P2, the DPS difference is not much, but Inori is still higher than mine. So the next step usually is I click on our names to check our skill cast whether Inori is doing more major skill than me or not. This is especially useful for single button DPS class like healers, because usually they compare their glare, doses, or broil cast since the majority of their DPS comes from the amount of cast they did. So apparently our casts are around the same amount, but my Age of Shadow just has a very low crit rate. Usually for tanks we want to be looking around 30 to 40%. But this means there's not much that I can improve from my P2, so I won't be looking too much into it later in XIVanalysis. Then in P3 is where the significant difference comes. I'm dealing much less than Inori's, around 300 RDPS, and this is much important than P2 where there's a lot of downtime. P3 is a full uptime phase, and you can identify this from the graph. See the graph over here is P2 where there are a lot of ups and downs, and P3 is just a huge mountain, which means it is a full uptime phase. And that means a huge chunk of your RDPS is calculated from this phase. So I'll be looking into it in XIVanalysis later on. Then moving on to P4. Yes, the DPS is only 100 lower, but the funny thing is my skills crit more than Inori, so I'm definitely missing out on something here. So I'll be looking at P4 in XIVanalysis too. After that, intermission is pretty much the same. We deal around the same amount of our DPS, so I won't be looking at the intermission too much. Then we move on to P5. Our P5 has a 200 DPS disparity, but Inori has a better crit on Edge of Shadow, so it's kinda understandable. So I won't be looking too much about P5, but I will still check on it a bit. After that is the dreaded P6. Now, if you have done DSR, you know how tricky to optimize this phase is. And as you can see, I am lacking a whopping 600 DPS from Inori. And even without looking at the crits, I know I'm doing something or a lot of things wrong in this phase. So I'll be looking extensively about P6 in XIVanalysis. Now, to the last phase. It is a full uptime fight and one of the longest phases in the fight. So your performance in this phase matters a lot. As you can see, this is probably the biggest difference between me and Inori, where I deal 6.1k RDPS and Inori dealt 6.5k RDPS. Now you might assume that Inori crits a lot and mine didn't, but you are wrong, since my crits are higher but I'm losing usage, as I have 2 less blood spiller compared to him. So I'll be looking into detail for P7 also. Now that we have all the information we need before going to the next tool, I will recap that I will be looking mainly on P3, P4, P6, and P7. This is to shorten the time that I need to check on the XIVanalysis. After that, we will simply be dropping our logs into the next tool, XIVanalysis. I will copy my logs and Inori's logs, and I will be comparing it together in more detail. The XIVanalysis is a tool to check on your rotation. You usually can do this from FFLOGS alone, but XIVanalysis usually is much better to learn from since it has a simpler user interface and more detailed information about your rotation and performance. I also won't be explaining too much about it, as there's a lot of video that explains it way better than me. But first, we're just going to copy Inori's log link into XIVanalysis, and it will immediately show you this window of the whole party. Because we're only going to analyze Inori, we can just click on his name. And there's a whole bunch of information that you can see on how your usage of skills and abilities goes, but you have to know that in Ultimate there are a lot of variables to take into account. But most of the time on full uptime fight like Savages or Extreme, these checklists and suggestions are pretty accurate, I would say. We can also see the estimate GCD used by the player, so you can match it. And there's a lot of useful optimization info that is tailored specifically to that class by the experts. But the most important part for me is the timeline. This is where I will be analyzing the info that we already have from the FFLOGS that we compared previously and check on what Inori is actually doing rotation wise. It also helps you if you have videos of the fight while analyzing this, so you know exactly what happens during this specific timeline. First off, P2. I won't be checking too much since we are going more for P3 as we talked before, but I already know that something can be improved from my opener, which is mostly the same, but I saw that Inori used plunge before his first GCD. This allows him to have 3 plunge instead of 2 during the opener like I did. The second thing is that he also immediately used Salted Earth after the first GCD. This allows him later on before Sanctity to use Salted Earth earlier and gets an extra tick. And here he also used his Shadowbringers. At first I thought this was weird, as this was outside the 2-minute window, but this allows Inori to actually have more casts of Shadowbringers in total, and I will bring it up later on. Moving on to P3. If you see that right before the phase change, Inori actually didn't pre-pull the blood weapon. Instead, he did 3 GCD first. I know that this later portion is during Thornton's weakness, so that's probably the reason why. But also it actually is better alignment than mine, since if you check on P3, I have a few blood spiller outside the stratagem and battle inlay, which is probably contributes to my lack of DPS, so I think I will change that. After that we move to P4. So this is the main difference. Previously I said that I noticed a slight difference in DPS, but I have a better crit in this phase. So apparently it is because Inori is using the one Shadowbringer in P2 where I didn't. Other than that, there's not much difference. If you remember how Inori spent Shadowbringers in P2 after Strength that I didn't do, it actually pays up here, and both will come back up in P6 if you spend it all in cooldown. So it actually makes a lot of sense. The first big issue that I noticed here is at the second burst window, I lost a lot of GCD compared to Inori. This might be because we are taking separate tank busters and I was walking on Worm Breath too, but honestly it shouldn't be this bad from my end, since we should be having a full uptime even if it happens. The second big issue is that my lack of DPS is apparently from my Shadowbringer hits. If you see here, I only managed to spam 3 Shadowbringers here, whereas Inori spammed 4. And if you check on FFLOGS, his Shadowbringers actually hit 8 times, which means he hit both dragons on all occasions, while mine only hit 3 out of 3 times, which means I only hit 1 dragon each time. This is definitely a huge loss, so now I know I have to try and hit both on all occasions. Lastly, the most important phase where we have full uptime. The first thing I noticed is that my alignment is very bad in P7. I don't know why, but I press all my bursts here when I should be holding until Giga 1 where the burst window actually comes. And while we are on the burst window, I actually overcapped my blood gauge, which makes it even worse. This might be the reason why I lost usage of Blood Spiller compared to Inori. My bad alignment actually impacts the whole phase because I can't use my pot during the burst window, and I drifted it so far away. And while we're at it, my blood weapon also drifts from Delirium, which makes it even worse. Basically, everything can be improved in P7 for me because my whole rotation here is just a mess. So, from the statistics and rotation that we analyzed from FFLOGS XIVanalysis, I came into conclusion that 1. I should be spending my Shadowbringers on cooldown in early phases. Number 2, I need to try and hit 2 dragons in P6 with Shadowbringers and have a better weaving. And lastly, I need to have a better alignment of my burst in P7. And all of that I can apply for my next Dark Knight run in DSR. And that's how I usually try to get good on classes that I'm actually not familiar with. Let me know if there's anything different from what you usually do, or if you learn anything new from this video, please let me know in the comment section down below. Hopefully it helps you, and that's all about it. See ya!